Could Stannis have won the Battle of the Blackwater and taken the Iron Throne? It was a close-run thing, so was there anything he could have done to prevail? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into George R.R. Martin's world of ice and fire, as well as other great fantasy worlds like The Lord of the Rings. If you're new here, welcome. The Battle of the Blackwater was the largest and most pivotal battle in the War of the Five Kings, and the culmination of many plot lines in A Clash of Kings. It left Joffrey and the Lannisters, technically still House Baratheon, in power in King's Landing, and Stannis licking his wounds back on Dragonstone. But was there anything Stannis could have done to change the outcome? Well, let's start by briefly outlining what actually happened before talking about what Stannis could have done differently, because it was a close-run thing. Stannis set off from Storm's End with a sizable fleet of perhaps 200 ships, with his army split between there and a vanguard that set across land, and arrived a few days earlier than the fleet on the opposite south side of the River Blackwater to King's Landing. Other than a few skirmishes, both sides held their fire until Stannis' main fleet arrived, and confident of its superiority in numbers, headed straight up the river. The plan was to drop off the parts of Stannis' army aboard the fleet on the city side of the river, then engage the much smaller Lannister navy, who were further upstream. Once the river was secure, the rest of Stannis' forces on the far side of the river could cross safely. That was the plan. Of course, the reality was that wildfire destroyed most of both navies, and a newly created chain across the mouth of the river prevented any escape. However, some of Stannis' forces did manage to land and started attacking the King's Gate, and the sheer number of boats in the river estuary formed a makeshift wooden bridge of sorts, allowing still more of Stannis' troops to cross over. At which point we should note that the defenders of King's Landing were not exactly battle-hardened veterans. There were a few Lannister soldiers and some called up from nearby garrisons, but most of the force were either sellswords of dubious loyalty or goldcloaks, the City Watch, 2/3 of whom were very recent recruits. This is important because it means they needed strong leadership. But very early in the battle, the Lannister leadership became absent. Sandor Clegane, member of the King's Guard and fearsome fighter, quit the battlefield. Tyrion, acting Hand of the King, led a sortie outside the city walls and didn't return. King Joffrey himself left the battlements for the safety of the Red Keep. Meanwhile, the number of Stannis' troops outside the King's Gate kept on increasing. Morale among the defenders on the walls imploded, with hundreds fleeing their posts. Things got so bad that Lancel Lannister reported to Cersei that the battle was lost. Which is when Tywin Lannister turned up with a combined Lannister-Tyrell army, hugely outnumbering Stannis' forces, and attacked. It was all Stannis could do to extract some of his army onto his remaining fleet and head back to Dragonstone, defeated. So, what could Stannis have done differently? Well, perhaps his fleet could have held back rather than run straight into the wildfire trap set by Tyrion. That would have been a start, and perhaps he could have brought Melisandre with him as she wanted. He was persuaded not to, because had she been there and he'd won, people would have put the victory down to her presence rather than him. It's less clear exactly what she would have done if she were there. Perhaps provide some kind of protection against the wildfire, or conjure another shadow baby to kill Tyrion. Both could have turned the tide of the battle, or perhaps she could have foreseen the wildfire, or the advances of the Lannister-Tyrell army in the flames, so they could change tactics. All she says on the subject, rather enigmatically later, is that, "Had I been with you, your battle would have had a different ending. But his grace was surrounded by unbelievers, and his pride proved stronger than his faith. His punishment was grievous, but he has learned from his mistake." The fact is that even if Stannis had got enough troops onto the King's Landing side of the river quickly enough, broken through the King's Gate swiftly, and moved on to attack the Red Keep with a minimum of losses, Tywin and the Tyrells would have arrived that same day, with, depending on which report you listen to, perhaps 70,000 men to take on Stannis' 20,000 or so. No, unless Melisandre was able to do something very impressive in battle, Stannis was always set to be trapped between a massively larger army and the river, the city walls, or the Red Keep itself. When you think about it, Stannis' best chance of taking King's Landing was to attack earlier, much earlier, before Tywin and Mace Tyrell forged their alliance. When you read back through the early chapters of A Clash of Kings, you can see that this is the big concern in King's Landing. Stannis may not have had many men at that point, but King's Landing was very badly defended. The chain, the wildfire, the extra gold cloaks, the defensive siege weaponry, the soldiers from Stokeworth and Rosby, all these came later. Tywin and the main bulk of the Lannister army had not come back to defend King's Landing because of the threat from the Northern Army. So, what if Stannis had allied with Robb? Robb showed himself to be an able general, winning several battles and even managing to tempt Tywin and his army out of his stronghold at Harrenhal and out to the west, leaving the route to King's Landing open. And if Stannis had allied himself early with Robb, he would potentially have had the North and the Riverlands on his side as well as his own forces, which might have given even Renly and some of his supporters pause for thought. Robb could very probably have kept Tywin away from King's Landing, giving Stannis a free run at it, before Tyrion had time to organise the defences a bit. Yes, that could have worked. So, why didn't he do it? Well, after Robb was made king in the north, it was a definite no-no for Stannis, as he says to Cat Stark, "I am the rightful king, and your son no less a traitor than my brother here. His day will come as well." This is Stannis very much in his only subjects and enemies mode. He wouldn't ally himself with someone who also claimed kingship over some of the Seven Kingdoms. But there were perhaps 3 months between news of Robert's death and Robb being made king, and at no point during that period did Stannis formally claim the crown, reach out to anyone outside the Stormlands, or show his hand at all. In fact, it's nearly 5 months before he sends that letter proclaiming Joffrey a bastard and himself the rightful king. It's a major point of discussion during books 1 and 2. What was he doing all that time? If he believed Joffrey was illegitimate, why didn't he claim the crown straight away? I think the answers to this come in the prologue to A Clash of Kings, where we finally see Stannis. He is absent for all of Book 1, and one of the first things he did was to send out Davos to gauge support for himself among the Stormlords. The answer came back that broadly, other than the few who owed allegiance directly to Dragonstone, they were instead siding with Renly. He spent some time weighing up Melisandre's claims and powers, and he hesitated to press his claim because he had no absolute proof that Joffrey wasn't Robert's son, as we see in this exchange with Davos. "You have no proof of this incest, no more than you did a year ago. There's proof of a sort at Storm's End, Robert's bastard, the one he fathered on my wedding night, in the very bed they'd made up for me and my bride. Delena was a Florent and a maiden when he took her, so Robert acknowledged the babe. Edric Storm, they call him. He is said to be the very image of my brother. If men were to see him, and then look again at Joffrey and Tommen, they could not help but wonder, I would think. Yet how are men to see him if he is at Storm's End?" Stannis drummed his fingers on the painted table. "It is a difficulty, one of many." In summary, Stannis was cautious, whereas Renly was rash. Stannis wanted the proof to back up his claim, whereas Renly was content to simply claim the crown by force. By the time Stannis had decided on a course of action, heading to Storm's End at Melisandre's urging, his chance of an early decisive strike at King's Landing was gone, and his list of potential allies grew thin. It does appear that there's an element here of everyone else declaring themselves as king, forcing him to do it, even without the proof he craved. All of which is very understandable, as we know Stannis' character, but I suppose that's the point. It took Stannis around a year from fleeing King's Landing to declaring himself, because that's what Stannis is like. If Renly had been in that situation, I suspect that things would have moved a lot quicker. Which leads us to the conclusion that although Stannis could theoretically have taken King's Landing by forging an alliance with Robb or acting more decisively when he didn't have the proof to back up his claim, before King's Landing's defences were improved, he, as a character, would never have done those things needed. And there is one other element to this. Whereas Melisandre never outright says that Stannis' defeat was a part of her plans, she does say that Stannis being king is not what she views as his highest calling. That is to be Azor Ahai born again. That Stannis has learned his lesson to trust her, and that ultimately the Battle of the Blackwater does not affect Stannis' fate. Could Stannis have won? Others could have in his position, but not him, because of who he is, not whether he was a good enough general. And if he had one, would he have been so willing to trust Melisandre and head north with his army? Again, probably not. He would probably have dug himself into King's Landing, awaiting attacks from other pretenders. Stannis is such a rich character in the story because we know how he will react. And here, perhaps it is a good thing that he didn't win, because otherwise he may not have headed north and saved Jon and the Night's Watch, and the story would have been very different. If you'd like more videos diving deep into the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, there's a playlist on the left of your screen now. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.